Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Prelude and VTF Bootcamp. We're excited to have you join us today and for the next 2 days. This bootcamp is designed for entry-level IT and cybersecurity professionals. No prior knowledge or experience is required, but it does help to have a familiarity with IT and cybersecurity terminology. So I'm David Hunt. I'm the CTO here at Prelude. I've spent my career trying to build security solutions that can continuously test production environments, mostly against adversary behaviors, but also against things like TTPs, payloads, things you'll find off of the MITRE attack matrix, things that we're going to learn about shortly today and tomorrow and the day after. Before Prelude, I worked at MITRE, where I built their first open source automated adversary emulation framework, which is called Caldera. You can find that on GitHub. I was on the attack leadership team, and I set up many of the first adversary emulation playbooks for MITRE Ingenuity. Before MITRE, I spent time at other companies such as John Deere, Mandiant, and FireEye, Kenna Security, and have worked in and out of the government as well on the United States side. My career has been spent mostly doing offensive cyber operations. And so that means lots of red team actions, lots of development of offensive capabilities. And I've been doing this work for, I'd say around 16 or 17 years at this point. So hopefully a lot that we're going to go over is going to be solid information that will be grounded in the experience that I've had over the years, and is hopefully something that will benefit everybody in terms of building your own careers. So let's get to it. What is this program actually about? Today, we're going to focus on the offensive side of cybersecurity. Tomorrow, we'll focus on the blue team, the defensive side, which will likely be the most relevant to the early stages of an IT or cybersecurity career. Getting into the industry, you start to realize most people are on the blue or defensive side, to where a lot of the needs are at the enterprise level or within most companies. There's a smaller segment that is on the red and purple teams that is in assessment and validation of all the work going on the defensive side. It's a lot easier to get in on the defensive side and kind of move into offense, but there is opportunities out of the gate for the offense as well. By focusing on the offensive side today, we will help add context to what you learn about the blue team, defensive side tomorrow. These things work hand in glove, they work together. And so understanding how defenses work will obviously help you on the offensive side and vice versa. We will wrap things up on day 3 with an end-to-end security team exercise, utilizing the knowledge and skills you gained during the first 2 days. At the end of day 3, you'll be able to run security tests. You'll be able to scale those tests, contextualize the results like a normal security professional would, and write a summarizing report. A lot of the effort that you go through in security testing, whether red or blue, revolves around the concept of providing context. How do you portray the value, the impact that your testing or defenses have had? You need to portray that to other people in the organization so they understand without having to have the security, knowledge and domain knowledge that maybe you have. However, a lot of this isn't until day 3, so let's not get ahead of ourselves. Again, welcome to everyone who is watching and to VTF for putting this together. We hope you find this continuous security testing bootcamp valuable. So let's get to it. What is this program actually about? Today, we'll be focused on the offensive side of cybersecurity. Tomorrow, as we go more on the blue side, we will be focused heavily on defenses, but we'll save that for tomorrow. Why do we do what we do at Prelude? Why do we exist? So I want to talk a little bit about the people, the organization that I come from, what we do to help add a little bit of context here. So when a major cybersecurity attack happens, every relevant governance body, call it a board of directors, a national government, intelligence agencies, federal governments in different countries, they ask the same fundamental question. Are we vulnerable to this attack? It could be a vulnerability. It could be a piece of malware that just came out. It could be a CISA advisory. Today, the answer to this question is a uniform and terrifying, I don't know. When Advisories come out. For example, the snake malware advisory came out just a few days ago, put out by CISA. If you read through that, excuse me, you will realize that there is a significant amount of damage that piece of malware and set of behaviors can actually accomplish. That malware can be very difficult to find, especially if you don't have the right tools and processes and people on board to find it. And so not understanding what the impact of that type of malware or behaviors would be on your environment can cause significant downstream damage to the rest of the organization. So without the ability to directly ask your system questions in order to elicit internal intelligence, cyber defenses continue to operate in a model that will not allow them to understand whether you're protected or unprotected until an adversary looks to attack your systems, at which point it's too late. At scale, Prelude is designed to continuously probe millions of hosts with critical tests in order to gather national scale intelligence about the efficacy of the nation's cyber defenses. So this is where a lot of skills that I've learned in my past and my experience, and hopefully will impart some of that knowledge or as much as I can on the offensive side to you all this week. And the tests that we're going to be learning about, how we're going to learn to write them, it's really about how do we test the individual endpoints in an organization to understand how secure they are, what is their posture, and then how do we make them more secure. This bootcamp is a 3-day workshop that focuses on the understanding the basics of offensive security, blue teaming, purple teaming, with Prelude tools, along with things that you can do outside of Prelude. Along the way, we're going to be introducing our open source tool, largely open source, Prelude Detect, completely free. You can access this online. This will allow security professionals to continuously test their production environments against adversary behaviors and critical vulnerabilities. We'll be explaining the mission that we bring to businesses, governments, and organizations of all sizes, along with the community and kind of what we're hoping to accomplish with a lot of our efforts in places like GitHub and open source code areas. At the end of the bootcamp, hopefully you're going to understand the basics of offensive security, blue teaming, and purple teaming. We'll define all these along the way. You'll have a working knowledge of how Prelude Detect works. You'll be able to run your own security tests. You'll be able to write your own security tests. You will also have the skills to analyze and interpret the results of the tests themselves. This is the key component that we'll want to focus a lot of time on. And then the last thing, finally, you're going to have an understanding of our mission and how you can join us in the efforts to bring more certainty to cybersecurity. Prelude is a very open community. We do a lot of our stuff in GitHub and open to the world. We believe in transparency and accessibility of cybersecurity toolings. For many decades, cybersecurity has kind of been a dark area. It's been hidden. People try to keep a lot of the tradecraft of offensive work under the covers and not accessible. What we do at Prelude is we try to bubble that up, try to make it very known how we operate, and make those tools available to everybody. Okay, let's get started. Offensive security is an approach to cybersecurity that involves proactively attempting to exploit vulnerabilities in order to identify and address security weaknesses. Offensive security includes activities such as penetration testing, vulnerability scanning, red team assessments. These are kind of the 3 big buckets. You'll also hear terminology like adversary emulation, simulation, and a variety of other kind of spins off penetration testing, mind you. Now, these are the 3 main ones, though: pen testing, vuln scanning, red team assessments. Offensive security can be used to find and fix security issues before they're exploited by malicious actors. The goal, if you were to boil all of this down to why we do offensive security, this is it. It's proactive. We want to find the issues before anybody else does, which gives us the time to resolve them for the organization or on the organization's behalf before an actual malicious actor comes in and takes advantage. In order to be the most effective in offensive security, you need to be curious about how things work. The number 1 trait when people ask me, how do I get into offensive security? How do I become a red teamer? Constant curiosity. The tricky part with especially offensive security is you need to understand how so many different technologies work down at their base root level, at the primitive level. So you need to understand the building blocks of compiled languages, scripting languages, dynamic languages on the web, so things like JavaScript. You need to understand not only how to write them, but how they operate and how they work in order to fundamentally, in the back of your mind, always know where to look for those vulnerabilities. You also need to know a lot of the popular tools, SaaS products that exist. You need to understand how they work, how they operate, because you're going to run into them on offensive assessments. And understanding how they operate allows you to take advantage of them. An example that I like to pull out is one-time use file shares. So in order to exfiltrate data off of a system, a lot of times I will use services such as Pastebin or file.io. These are places where I'm able to put an encrypted one-time upload of a file onto a share and download it from a completely different computer and do it all anonymously. And so understanding how all of those kinds of tools and methodologies may work together is a ton of time. And it takes a curious person to constantly stay up on all the latest trends and tricks and tools. Offensive security can be used to find and fix security issues before they're ever exploited. So in order to be the most effective in offensive security, you need to be curious about how things work, how they break, and how you make them do things, especially that they're not designed to do. This can be a big change from the building and maintaining more defensive mindset, which many people spend practically their entire life operating within. Software engineers build things, as they often say. Security engineers break things. Often, offensive and defensive security are represented by two opposing sides: red team, the blue team. Red teaming is a form of offensive security that involves simulating malicious attackers or other goal-oriented objectives to test an organization's security defenses. So red teaming, again, your offensive team. Red teaming is often used by organizations to test their defenses against potential attacks and to find weaknesses in a security posture. Most organizations have a security policy. These are the rules and regulations and processes that are required at the organization for IT or compliance reasons. An example of that is you must rotate your password every 90 days, or your password must be 14 characters, including a special character and an uppercase letter, right? These are policies that would fall under cybersecurity. You may have other things like we need a screen lock enabled after 15 minutes on every device, or your machine cannot be a bring your own device, BYOD, at the organization. Every organization has this kind of laundry list, long list of security policies that they try to maintain. And red teaming, using red teaming, it allows you to proactively and constantly hit each one of those policies, whether they're IT policies or new application development that the organization is doing, in order to understand and kind of fix problems before they get propagated out to adversaries. The goal of red teaming is to find and exploit security vulnerabilities before the malicious actor. It's essentially, red teaming itself is essentially the devil's advocate. It's actually where the root of the term red teaming came from, which is prodding the defensive team for ways that their security posture is lacking by asking questions in the form of attacks. So we're going to go through this later on in this lesson as far as concept that we call rules, but you can consider this a constant question and answer game. Is there a password on this computer? Well, let me go as a red teamer and find out. Is there an SSH key that's hidden somewhere on the drive? Let me go find out. You're coming up with this constant set of kind of path-dependent questions that you're asking. Of course, you're executing these in the form of maybe terminal commands or custom payloads. You're doing it using technology, but it really, when you take the 4 steps back, you realize that, hey, what I'm doing is asking questions here. Now, blue teaming is a form of defensive security that involves monitoring and defending against malicious actors. Blue teaming is used by organizations to identify and respond to security threats, as well as to detect and prevent potential attacks. The goal of blue teaming is a little bit different than red teaming. It's to identify, respond to, and mitigate the potential attacks before they can be exploited. You can kind of see the combination here between the red and the blue and how these two work, with and against each other in what's called a red-blue exercise, which is an effort of a red team testing the blue team's policies, the blue team defending, and ensuring that they are resilient against the red team. Now, purple teaming is the middle child. That is a form of combined offensive and defensive security that involves both red and blue teaming activities. Purple teaming is used by organizations to find and address security weaknesses in a coordinated way. Now, purple teaming really started to get popular around 2015 or so. And the reason it got popular was due to miscommunication between red and blue teams. Originally, when red and blue teams would work together, they'd talk different languages. Red teams are used to breaking things, blue teams are used to protecting things. And because of that, the methodologies a red team would use didn't really translate well. So, for example, a red teamer may go in and hack into a system and break into a system, and they would give the blue team a list of ways that they did it. The blue team would look at that, they would read it. It's almost like they're reading a different language. They don't really understand what's happening. And that communication barrier is what caused quite a bit of issues to kind of slide by. Now, purple teaming got popular around, again, 2015 or so as a way to bridge the communication gap between red and blue teams. So a purple teamer has 50% of knowledge in red, 50% in blue. They aid both teams to be successful. Now, companies nowadays are starting to build up their purple team. So they typically have a small red team, maybe a couple of people, really large blue team, and then purple teams are starting to become a little bit bigger. Now, you have to know both the language that red teams use as well as the language blue teams use and be able to reconcile and translate between those two teams. That's what it takes to be an effective purple teamer today. Penetration tests and red team engagements are tests conducted by security professionals in order to evaluate an organization's security posture. These tests involve attempting to gain access to an organization's systems in order to identify security weaknesses and vulnerabilities. The results of these tests are then used to develop a plan of action to address any identified security weaknesses. Red team engagements are similar to penetration tests, but they involve simulating malicious attackers in order to test an organization's security defenses. Now we're going to graduate into a little bit of a more complicated area. Adversary emulation and simulation fall under the red team umbrella, more so than the penetration testing, although there's a lot of terminology here. Common tools that get used for offensive security include command and control. You'll see that called as C2, vulnerability scanners, breach and attack simulation tools, port scanning, lots of kind of what they call living on the land utilities, such as Netcat and other things that exist on most operating systems by default. Like Python used to come installed on Macs by default, common adversary tool. These tools allow for the probing of defenses, as well as the ability to execute attacks against developer or staging environments. Now, there's a lot of debate in cybersecurity on the offensive side in terms of how do you define pen testing? How do you define red teaming? So a lot of this is methodology based. So the way I like to think of it is penetration testing is your ability from the outside of a network or a computer to address and locate the issues on the perimeter. How do you do port scans, understand the vulnerabilities from the outside? Red teaming and adversary emulation, I really like the inside position. So how do you monitor and understand, assuming that you've already breached the perimeter? At that point, how do you attack and address security issues? That's kind of where I draw the line between these. MITRE ATT&CK is a globally accessible knowledge base of adversary tactics and techniques that's based on real-world observations. It's used by security professionals to understand and identify the actions, behaviors, and tools used by potential adversaries. Attack is an area that I've spent a lot of time on, obviously working at MITRE for a number of years and building the Caldera framework, which uses TTPs off of this matrix. The matrix itself, you'll notice it kind of looks like an Excel spreadsheet. You have rows and columns that designate different types of attacks. You'll find this at attack.mitre.org, something worth looking into and understanding. This is a very used aspect of red teaming and offensive security. I would treat it as a shared language. The big value that MITRE ATT&CK has provided me and other people I know is it is the first technology that really exists that allows us to speak the same language. And when we talk about attacks or defenses, that we can point at different things on a chart and understand that we're using the same words. At the highest level, the attack framework is divided into different goals and phases, which are called tactics. Examples of tactics include initial access. How do you get into a computer? Credential access. How do you dump credentials off of a computer? Lateral movement. How do you move from one computer to another? Now, tactics are further divided into techniques, which represent the actions used by adversaries to achieve their tactical goals. Techniques are further divided into procedures. These are the actual implementations that represent the steps taken by adversaries to execute a technique. So again, tactics, techniques, procedures, TTP. That's our acronym we're going to be working from. A TTP, you can think of, is shorthand for just procedure. So the implementation of a particular technique is what we refer to as a TTP. When we talk about security tests, or as you'll hear soon, verified security tests, think about those as TTPs or procedures. There are many, many procedures for every technique, basically an infinite number. So I'd see a lot of companies in my history have treated MITRE ATT&CK matrix as a bingo card, which is if I can test every box, I can then say I'm secure from that particular technique. The problem with that approach is the infinite number of procedures that exist for each box. Just because you're protected against one doesn't mean you're protected against another. And so you want to be careful not to treat MITRE ATT&CK as that, but instead as a common or shared language. While MITRE ATT&CK and TTPs have done a good job of helping to add structure to the way we talk about cybersecurity, there are plenty of disadvantages to the way cybersecurity happens today. One of the major issues is that these tests take a long time to complete due to the manual and specialized nature. One of the things that you'll learn talking to red teamers today is the amount of time it takes to do two things. One, establish an initial foothold in an environment. Two is to write your own custom TTPs or payloads. We're going to talk about a way around that in just a few minutes. Additionally, another kind of major issue is these tests are often limited in scope and can be difficult to scale. A lot of them require the manual setup of tools and processes on a system being tested. Call them dependencies. In order to run this test, I need 3 dependencies and this other thing needs to be true. If every test has that sort of structure and dependencies, it becomes very difficult to run them and to predict what is runnable. This difficulty of scaling makes traditional offensive security prohibitively expensive for many organizations. You need to hire a manual red team to come in, which takes all of this time, energy, and money. That expense comes despite the fact that the tests are only run once, maybe twice, a couple times a year, which leaves a lot of gap periods. So I call this point-in-time testing. If I bring a red team in today and we test all of our systems and we spend the whole week doing it, I understand a point in time, how secure was I within the scope of the test for that week. If I go ahead and I adjust code next week, the week after, maybe add a couple new endpoints and computers into my system, a few new servers, well, now you kind of get the picture. Things are untested. And so red teaming needs to happen faster. The gaps have to be smaller. The data collected during these tests is often unstructured and is difficult to interpret, which makes it hard to draw meaningful insights from the tests. Finally, the tests are often conducted in a lab or a development environment. Whereas in the real world, attackers pretty much always target production systems. That's where what they call the crown jewels exist. The database connections or passwords, the AD environment information, the access to the executive laptops at a company, the emails, servers, all that sort of stuff. That's your production environment. That's really where a lot of the gold lives, or crown jewels as they call it. So all of these kind of disadvantages that stack up means that currently security tests are not accurately reflecting security of a system in a production environment, which is a lot of the effort that myself and team have kind of gone into in recent years as far as how do we solve that problem? How do we actually start to develop tests that are designed around continuous? If expensive, limited security tests don't accurately, it is our goal to solve these problems with the security industry. And so far, we've released research and multiple tools that we feel gets the ball rolling. We iterated on the concept of TTPs by adding standardization and cleanup functions to reverse the effects of a test, which helps them in production environments. And we created the concept called a VST, a verified security test. This is an open source concept. You can find this on our GitHubs and a few other sources online. VSTs are designed to test against relevant and critical vulnerabilities. We understood that many security and IT teams had agent fatigue, meaning I don't want to deploy another agent in order to run tests. This became a problem for security teams, right? They have enough things. They have an antivirus, they have an EDR. I don't want to deploy another thing. So we created a concept called probes. Again, these are open source. You'll find these in GitHub. These are lightweight processes that don't need to be installed at all, that know how to run the tests. So you have two parts here. You have VSTs, which is a production version of a TTP, and then you have a probe, which is a little bit of a 1 kilobyte process that knows how to run the test. So those two hand in glove, put on any computer, and you've got an open source system that knows how to run a test. The cool thing about probes, they require no installation. There's no special privileges, and they can run anywhere because they have zero dependencies. They typically range between 30 and 60 lines of code, and you can modify those lines of code if you want to toy around. Probes are designed that way so they can safely run on production environments, whereas a lot of development work happens in security on development environments. The goal for real security is moving that into production, do all of your testing in production. This provides a clear outline of protection on actual adversary targets. Now, what we've been building is a tool that is called Prelude Detect. This makes the testing continuously simple, so there's less time between tests and a reduction of gaps in the protection. Detect was designed to be used by both the security and IT teams within smaller organizations, not reserved for just the larger orgs. It's designed to make protecting endpoints and reducing their surface area more straightforward and accessible. Okay, before we talk about this concept of rules, or how do you ask an offensive question against a system for an answer, let's talk about a little bit of definition. So endpoints and their surface area. An endpoint is, let's say that endpoints represent hardware or software that contain a runtime of some sort responsible for managing applications. A classic endpoint example is a laptop. This device consists of hardware, an operating system, and applications that sit on top. There are innumerable variations of this device, as there's different hardware that can be paired with different operating systems that can be paired with lots of different combinations of applications installed on top. Each one could be configured differently. And so when you look at one computer to the next, you could actually signature them because of their infinite differences. What's consistent about an endpoint, however, is the surface area. Doesn't matter if it's a laptop or a traffic light. They both are endpoints by definition, but they have significantly different surface area. So a MacBook Air has a particular surface area that allows the user to install arbitrary software, compile code, or manipulate network traffic or memory space. You can do anything you want on a MacBook. Conversely, an iPad has a smaller surface area as these actions just aren't allowed. Strictly enforcing rules provides a smaller surface area. Well, what's a rule? A rule is a statement that would confine the surface area of an endpoint, if true, resulting in a more secure device. Rules are specific to the operating system of the endpoint. Every operating system has n number of rules that you could develop that would help you confine that surface area. This component is ultimately responsible for protecting the device from a software-based risk. The operating system needs to either vertically protect the device through things like entitlements on a MacBook or on an iPad, or have a third-party solution that's hooked in, an EDR, antivirus, something installed on top of the operating system. So the goal here with rules is to think of them as questions that you are saying, this must be true for the computer to be secure. Let's give a couple examples. The very first rule that we published was a test for the rule, known malware should be quarantined when it writes to disk. Now, this is a rule that we say should always happen. There isn't a computer under the sun that this should not be true of. Whenever known malware appears on a person's hard drive, we would expect something on that computer to clean it up and quarantine that file. Now, we wrote a number of tests that implement this particular rule, which means these tests test the rule. They verify whether it's working or not. So our tests do things like dropping malicious-enabled Excel documents on endpoints, things like dropping defanged copies of malware that come from recent ransomware events, things like Lockbit ransomware, Royal ransomware. We grab the actual malware samples, we defang them, and then we embedded them in a security test that tests this rule. By deploying these out on different endpoints, we're able to then determine, hey, are all of my machines in my network, are they abiding by this rule? Will they all quarantine malicious files, or will some of the endpoints just not do that for any number of reasons? Just by changing the file type from a spreadsheet, like the original test that we did with an Excel spreadsheet, malicious Excel macro, to a PDF or a Word document, you can create more tests for the rule. You can continue to create n number of tests for every rule. You can see that this rule complies with the goal. The rule is a statement that would confine the surface area of an endpoint, if true, resulting in a more secure device. If known malware is not being quarantined when it writes to the disk on an endpoint, the rule is not being followed, and the associated risk is inherently accepted. Rules can concern firewalls, sensitive information stored on endpoints, protecting local data from tampering, and so on and so forth. Notice that each one of the rules reduces the attack surface area of an endpoint if it's being followed. This isn't a complete list of rules here. We'll look at some others. This is also not a complete list of rules, but can hopefully provide more context for what we mean when we're talking about the topic. You can see that if these rules are not followed, risk is increased. You can imagine the negative of each one of these statements. These rules can be used by organizations of all sizes to reduce their attack surface area and make it more difficult for attackers to succeed. So how are these rules actually used? In addition to the rules framework that we created at Prelude, both Windows and Mac OS are currently taking strides to verticalize security and are working on a set of rules on their own systems and the operating systems that the OS itself can abide by. Now, Windows is more public-facing about their rules, which they call attack surface reduction, ASR rules, versus Apple, which is a little bit quieter in terms of how they talk about them. But you'll notice things like their security software stack includes things like gatekeeper and lockdown mode. These are things that inherently reduce the surface area of these machines in order to make them safer via less surface area. Each OS should abide by a set of rules that describes how best to limit the surface area. You should keep in mind the rule should always be in effect, or that resulting risk is accepted. The example from the quarantine rule, if an endpoint does not quarantine a malicious piece of malware, then that endpoint is inherently accepting the risk of whatever that malware may be capable of doing. Rules must be true in all cases, regardless of context. Understanding the rules being followed versus those being broken is critical intelligence for anyone responsible for IT and/or security management. For example, if a macOS rule states that malicious files should be quarantined and I have no antivirus, that's on me. What we help you do through security test writing and what you can learn in this workshop today is how to write tests that start to abide by rules and create rules yourself. We have rules we have built at Prelude. You may also create your own rules of things that you believe would help reduce the risk in your environment. A rule must be categorized by the represented surface area. So things like application space or network or shared memory space, you can classify those so you can understand which part of the surface area you're actually reducing. Now, a test should not try to test the entire rule itself, but just a specific part of the rule. So one test, you need more than one test to verify each rule, basically, is what I'm saying here. So the goal with rules is to give you a category of a question, and then you need many test implementations to kind of target the question from different angles. So this singular focus for a test means that you're required to write multiple tests. The benefit is that new tests can actually be produced rapidly. So in today's world of TTPs and building payloads and offensive security, it's often a long journey to writing something that's significantly capable of testing an OS. Now, with these VSTs, you can write really small, independent, isolated tests and produce one, release it, produce another, release it, and do that rapidly. If rules are approved by testing, then the next step is to understand what a test does and how it works. The test validation process is a combination of peer review and programmatic testing that ensures each test is safe to run. Tests are used to verify specific implementations of rules. There's not a single test that can verify an entire rule. When we write security tests, we think that we should answer a logical question. So the answer of the question is pretty easy to interpret. Have standardized output so you can actually make sense of the results at scale, not just one at a time. Be structured in a way that supports extensibility into any type of device, including things that aren't computers. Contain the ability to reverse any effects that the test created, so cleaning itself up basically. And then finally, compile to a standard binary so it doesn't matter the language you write the test in. That shouldn't be a requirement. At Prelude, we do all of our tests in Go, but there isn't a reason that you couldn't write a test in C or Rust or Swift or any language that compiles down to a binary. If you're choosing a scripting language, the reason why I kind of exclude those from tests is that scripting languages require a runtime that may or may not be installed by default on the computer. Most of the discussion surrounding tests is currently around TTPs or procedures. These TTPs have many disadvantages, especially when it comes to the requirements we just listed. They don't necessarily answer a logical question. They don't usually have a standardized output. It's usually just arbitrary text. They aren't structured for extensibility, and they generally don't include a cleanup function by default that can reverse what the test does. Due to the flaws in traditional TTPs, this is why we developed the concept of VSTs. And again, open source concept that we'll go over. These VSTs solve the problems we just discussed and can be used by organizations of any size or individuals to verify that they are following the security rules that they set. You set up the rules first. Basically, think of that like a dynamic cybersecurity policy. So you develop and say, what do I want to ensure that all of my computers either do or don't do in the environment? That's your rule set. And then you ensure that you have security tests that align to each one of your rules. So how are these VSTs used in the real world to solve actual problems? We'll start with the core ones. Security testing has long been reserved for low-scale development environments. The results are typically extrapolated to the infrastructure as a whole. The decisions that follow are made with partial information. These decisions guide answers to questions like, will my controls protect me against the latest CVE? How would we respond to the latest SysAt alert? How many of our devices have a private key on them? These are the major questions that are asked every day by company boards, security leaders. Like we said at the beginning of the day, the current answer to these questions is usually, I don't know, which is the major problem. This comes from the incomplete information provided by existing security tools and tests. VSTs change that and let security teams say with certainty that they are protected from a particular attack. We created Detect in order to provide a way to easily use the VSTs at scale inside a production environment. You can use VSTs outside of Detect, completely open source concept. Detect is used for, which is also free to use, is used more to make sense of the context of what the tests are doing. That's the end of the keynote for today. We'll now move on to a demo of Prelude Detect and get you up and running with rules and VSTs.